Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But not all war is created equal. Some conflicts burn across forgotten worlds in the outer dark, where no one remembers the dead and the victors inherit nothing but ash. Others rage across entire sectors, consuming millions of lives in a conflagration that reshapes the political landscape of the Imperium for centuries to come. And then there is the war that every living soul in the galaxy fears above all others. What the war that comes to Terra. Terra. Holy Terra. The throne world. The cradle of mankind. The seat of the God Emperor. Call it whatever name you wish, and every name carries the weight of 10,000 years of blood and faith and desperate survival. This is the world where humanity was born, where the Emperor first walked among mortals, where he unified a fractured species and launched the greatest military campaign the galaxy has ever known. And it is the world where he now sits, entombed upon the golden throne, his ruined body sustained by ancient machines and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, holding back the darkness that would swallow everything humanity has ever built. For 10 millennia, the enemies of mankind have dreamed of reaching Terra. The Chaos Gods whisper of it in the nightmares of their champions. The traitor legions, those bitter sons who turned their backs on the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, have spent 10,000 years plotting their return to the world they once nearly conquered. Abaddon the Despoiler has launched 13 Black Crusades with the ultimate goal of reaching Terra and finishing what his predecessor Horus began. And in the closing days of the 41st millennium, that dream became a reality in ways that no one, not the High Lords, not the Custodians, not the Inquisition, could have anticipated. Tonight we are going to tell that story in full, or we are going to trace the long, winding, blood-soaked road that chaos has traveled in its relentless march toward the heart of the Imperium. We will begin at the very start, when the first seeds of betrayal were planted in the hearts of the Emperor's most trusted sons. We will walk through the ashes of the Horus Heresy and the first terrible siege of Terra, when brother fought brother on the sacred soil of mankind's homeworld. We will follow the long vigil of 10,000 years, as the Imperium built its defenses and the forces of chaos probed and tested and schemed in the shadows. We will trace Abaddon's grand strategy, the Crimson Path, a plan that stretched across 13 separate crusades and 10 millennia of patient, methodical destruction. We will witness the fall of Cadia, the shattering of the gate that held back the darkness, and the birth of the great rift that tore the galaxy in half. And finally, yet we will stand upon the walls of the Imperial Palace itself as blood rains from the sky and the legions of the Blood God pour forth from rips in reality to assault the Lion's Gate. This is the story of when chaos finally reached Terra, not once, but twice. And the terrible question that hangs over the Imperium like a funeral shroud is whether there will be a third time and whether humanity will survive it. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the ambient light dim in your mind's eye. And let me take you to a place beyond the stars, to a world that is at once the greatest fortress and the most tempting prize in all of existence. Let me take you to Terra. Before we begin, let me paint a picture for you of what it feels like to approach Terra from the void of space. Imagine you are aboard a pilgrim ship, one of the countless vessels that make the long, dangerous journey through the warp to deliver the faithful to the throne world. You have been traveling for months, perhaps years, the passage of time warped and distorted by the unreliable currents of the Imperium. Your fellow pilgrims huddle in the lower decks, praying and weeping and singing hymns to the God Emperor, their bodies wasted by malnutrition and their minds frayed by the constant low-frequency hum of the warp pressing against the ship's Geller field. And then, one day, the navigator announces that you have reached the Sol system, the ship translates back into real space. And the first thing you see is the sun, humanity's original star, burning with the same light that warmed the first humans who walked the plains of Africa millions of years ago. It is smaller than you expected somehow, and dimmer, as if the weight of 10,000 years of tragedy has dulled even the light of a star. But then you see Terra itself, and everything else falls away. The planet fills your viewport, not the blue and green marble that ancient Picts show from before the age of strife, but something else entirely. Terra is a world of metal and stone, its surface completely covered in the accumulated construction of tens of thousands of years of continuous habitation. The oceans are gone, boiled away, or buried under layers of urban sprawl that stretch from pole to pole. The atmosphere is a murky brown haze, thick with the exhaust of 1 trillion machines and the breath of a population that numbers in the hundreds of billions. And there, rising above everything else, visible from orbit as a mountain range of gold and adamantium that catches the light of the sun and blazes like a beacon, is the Imperial Palace. It is vast beyond comprehension. From space, it looks like an entire continent has been replaced by a single structure, a fortress cathedral city that sprawls across what was once the highest mountain range on Earth, and now serves as the foundation for the greatest defensive structure humanity has ever built. Spires and towers reach toward the heavens like stone fingers grasping for the stars, and between them, on landing pads and in courtyards the size of small nations, the ships of the Imperium come and go in an endless procession of commerce and war. This is what the pilgrim sees. This is what billions of humans dream of seeing, and what most will never live long enough to reach. And this is what the forces of chaos have coveted for 10,000 years. To understand why Terra matters so much, why it draws the hatred of the chaos gods and the ambitions of every warlord and demon prince in the galaxy, you first need to understand what Terra actually is. And I do not simply mean in the physical sense, although the physical reality of Terra is staggering enough. The Imperial Palace alone sprawls across the entirety of what was once the Himalayan mountain range, now called the Himalaysians. It is not a building in any conventional sense. It is a continent-spanning fortress, a city unto itself, a layered structure of walls and bastions and cathedrals and barracks that rises taller than the mountains upon which it was built. The outer walls are up to 1,000 meters in width and 1,500 meters in height, studded with gun citadels every 100 meters along their immense length. Inside those walls are power generators and ammunition trains, aircraft hangars and barracks, void shield generators and sensor arrays, are all maintained by a garrison that numbers in the hundreds of thousands. And that is just the outer wall. Beyond it lies layer after layer of fortification, designed originally by the Primarch Rogel Dawn himself, the master of defensive warfare, the Praetorian of Terra. Dawn took the beautiful architecture of the Emperor's palace and transformed it into the most impregnable fortress humanity has ever constructed. He did this knowing that one day the enemies of the Emperor would come, and that the palace would need to stand against the worst the galaxy could throw at it. At the very heart of this immense structure lies the Sanctum Imperialis, the inner sanctum, protected by the legendary Eternity Gate. Beyond that gate lies the Hall of the Golden Throne, a chamber almost 4 miles in length and half a mile in height, filled with churning apparatus, layers of stasis fields, psi fusion generators, and the heavy alchemical fog that enshrouds the Emperor's resting place. Here, atop mountains of ancient machinery, the Emperor sits in silent repose, watched over by the Adeptus Custodes, his guardians in life and death. But Terra is more than just the palace. The entire planet is a hive world of unimaginable population density, its surface covered in layer upon layer of construction accumulated over millennia upon millennia. The oceans boiled away long ago. The mountains, aside from the Himalaysians which form the foundation of the palace, should have been buried under urban sprawl. Trillions of souls live and die on Terra, most of them crowded into the hive cities that press up against the palace walls, their entire existence devoted to keeping the machinery of the Imperium grinding forward. And then there is the Astronomicon. Located within the Forbidden Fortress, built throughout the mountain range of the Himalayas, this is the psychic beacon that makes interstellar travel possible for the Imperium. 10,000 psychers continuously pour their life energies into this beacon, which reaches thousands of light years across the warp, guiding the mutant navigators who pilot humanity's ships through the otherwise trackless chaos of the Imperium. Without the Astronomicon, long-distance warp travel would be impossible, and the Imperium would fragment and die. The Astronomicon is connected to the Golden Throne by an enormous trench lined with mechanicum machinery and protected by void shield arrays and gun batteries. Luna, Earth's ancient moon, serves as an additional bastion. It is home to immense planetary defense lasers capable of engaging enemy fleets in orbit, and during the Great Crusade, it was the greatest shipyard and naval base in the Imperium. The entire Sol system is layered with defenses, from orbital weapons platforms to minefields to entire fortress worlds dedicated to the defense of the throne world. This is what the enemies of mankind seek to conquer, not just a planet, but the nexus of everything that holds the Imperium together. If Terra falls, the Astronomicon goes dark. If the Astronomicon goes dark, interstellar travel becomes nearly impossible. If travel becomes impossible, the Imperium shatters into a million isolated fragments, each one easy prey for the countless enemies that press in from all sides. And if the Emperor himself is slain or the Golden Throne destroyed, then the consequences are even more dire. For the Emperor's psychic presence is all that stands between humanity and the full, unrestrained power of the Chaos Gods. This is why Chaos has been trying to reach Terra for 10,000 years. This is the prize, the ultimate prize. And to understand how close they have come to claiming it, we need to go back to the very beginning, to the moment when the first crack appeared in the Emperor's grand design. The story of Chaos reaching Terra begins, as all the darkest stories in the Imperium do, with the Horus Heresy. And the Horus Heresy begins, as perhaps it was always meant to, with love corrupted into hatred and trust transformed into betrayal. In the days of the Great Crusade, the Emperor of Mankind led his forces across the galaxy in a campaign of reunification that had no equal in human history. At his side were the Primarchs, 20 genetically engineered demigods created from his own genetic material, each one a being of extraordinary power and ability, designed to serve as generals for his armies and governors for his reconquered worlds. Each Primarch was given command of a Space Marine Legion, tens of thousands of superhuman warriors created from their respective Primarch's gene seed, and together these forces swept across the stars, bringing world after world back into the fold of humanity. But the Chaos Gods, those malevolent intelligences that dwell within the dimension of psychic energy known as the Warp, had other plans. The Emperor's Great Crusade threatened everything they had built. His vision of a rational, enlightened humanity, and free from superstition and the influence of the Warp, would have starved the Chaos Gods of the emotional energy they needed to sustain themselves. They could not allow this to happen, and so they set about corrupting the Emperor's most trusted instruments. Through whispered promises and subtle manipulations, through exploiting the grievances and insecurities that festered in the hearts of the Primarchs, the Chaos Gods turned fully half of the Emperor's sons against him. Horus Lupercal, whilst the War Master himself, the most favoured and most trusted of all the Primarchs, was the first and most devastating loss. Wounded on the moon of Davin and brought to a chaos-tainted temple for healing, Horus was shown visions of a future where the Emperor had ascended to godhood, while his sons were forgotten, discarded tools of a tyrant's ambition. The visions were lies, of course, or at best half-truths, twisted to serve the purposes of the Dark Gods. But they found fertile soil in Horus's pride and his growing resentment of his father's seeming abandonment. One by one, more Primarchs fell. Lorgar of the Word-Bearers, whose devotion to the emperor as a god had been publicly rebuked, found new gods to worship in the warp. Angron of the World Eaters, a tortured soul, driven to madness by the neural implants forced into his brain, embraced the bloodlust that Horn offered. Magnus the Red, whose sorcerous attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery inadvertently destroyed the Emperor's secret webway project, found himself with nowhere to turn but the arms of Tzeentch. Fulgrim, Mortarion, Perturabo, Conrad Curzon, Alfarius Omegon. Each fell for different reasons, driven by different wounds and different temptations. But the result was the same. The Emperor's grand design was shattered. But the Horus heresy was not a single battle, but a galaxy-spanning civil war that lasted 7 years and claimed trillions of lives. It began with the drop site massacre at Istvan V, where 3 loyalist legions were lured into a trap and nearly annihilated by the combined forces of 8 traitor legions. From there, the war spread across the galaxy. Worlds burned, populations were exterminated. The infrastructure of the Imperium, so carefully built over 2 centuries of crusade, was torn apart by the very warriors who had constructed it. And through it all, the forces of chaos grew stronger. The traitor primarchs, once merely rebellious sons, began to undergo their own terrible transformations. Angron, fully given over to Horn's rage, was elevated to demonhood, becoming a demon prince of the blood god, a creature of pure wrath encased in corrupted flesh and warp-forged armor. Mortarion, stranded in the warp with his Death Guard legion, and succumbed to the plagues of Nurgle and became a demon prince of pestilence. Fulgrim embraced the excesses of Slaanesh. Magnus gave himself fully to Tzeentch. The traitor legions were no longer merely rebellious space marines. They were becoming something else entirely, vessels for the power of the Chaos Gods themselves. And wherever they marched, demons walked beside them. The loyalist forces fought back with desperate courage. Of the Ultramarines under Rabut Guilliman built a secondary empire in Ultramar, preserving a bastion of order in the chaos. The Space Wolves, the Dark Angels, and the remnants of the Shattered Legions fought their own campaigns against the traitors. But the terrible truth was that the loyalist forces were scattered, outnumbered, and unable to coordinate effectively across a galaxy torn apart by warp storms. And all of this, every battle, every betrayal, every world burned, and every life lost, while it was leading to one inevitable conclusion: Horus was coming to Terra. The scale of the heresy's devastation cannot be overstated. Before the betrayal, the Imperium was the largest and most powerful human civilization that had ever existed, encompassing millions of worlds across the galaxy, linked by warp travel and unified under the Emperor's vision of rational, secular governance. The Great Crusade had been humanity's finest hour, as a period of expansion and discovery that saw human colonies reunited, alien empires broken, and the foundation laid for what the Emperor intended to be a new golden age. All of that was now ash. The Forge worlds that had supplied the Emperor's armies now produced weapons for both sides of the conflict, their output divided between loyalty and treachery. Entire sectors that had been peaceful and prosperous were transformed into war zones, where populations were forced to choose sides. And those who chose wrong, or who simply had the misfortune to be in the path of advancing armies, were slaughtered without mercy. The human cost was incalculable. Trillions died in the fighting. Entire planetary populations were exterminated. Worlds that had been garden paradises were transformed into death worlds, their atmospheres poisoned by viral bombardments, their surfaces scarred by orbital strikes, their ecosystems destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. The cultural losses were equally devastating. Libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years were burned. Works of art that represented the highest achievements of human creativity were destroyed or defaced. The institutions that the Emperor had built to govern his Imperium were corrupted from within or dismantled by the traitors. And through it all, the forces of chaos grew stronger with every drop of blood that was spilled. The warp, That dimension of psychic energy that mirrors and feeds upon the emotions of living beings, was gorging itself on the suffering of the heresy. The raw emotional energy generated by a galaxy-spanning civil war, the hatred and fear and rage and despair of trillions of sentient beings, poured into the Imperium like fuel into a furnace, empowering the Chaos Gods and their servants to levels of strength that had not been seen in millennia. By the time Horus began his final advance on Terra, he commanded a force that was more than just a military army. It was a supernatural phenomenon, an apocalypse on legs, a convergence of corrupted transhuman warriors, mortal soldiers driven mad by chaos worship, demonic entities given physical form by the sheer weight of blood and suffering that surrounded them, and god machines whose machine spirits had been replaced by screaming demon intelligences. Behind this host, the warp itself pressed forward, all reality fraying at the edges as the barrier between dimensions weakened under the sustained assault of so much concentrated malice. The stage was set for the greatest battle in human history, the Siege of Terra. Even the name carries a weight that presses down upon the soul. This was not merely a battle, it was the defining moment of human history, the point upon which the fate of the entire species balanced like a blade upon the edge of a precipice. Everything that the Emperor had built, everything that humanity had achieved in its long climb from the caves of ancient Earth to the stars themselves, came down to this single, terrible confrontation. Horus did not arrive at Terra alone. He came at the head of the largest army the galaxy had seen since the Great Crusade itself. 7 traitor legions, millions of corrupted Imperial army soldiers, mutants, cultists, the war machines of the Dark Mechanicum, and entire Titan legions that had been possessed by demonic entities. All of them converged on the Sol system with one purpose: the destruction of the Emperor and the conquest of his throne world. The loyal defenders were formidable but outnumbered. 3 full Space Marine legions stood ready, the Imperial Fists under Rogel Dawn, who had spent years fortifying the palace for exactly this moment. The Blood Angels under the winged Primarch Sanguinius, beloved of all who knew him, and the White Scars under Jagatai Khan, masters of rapid warfare whose lightning attacks would prove crucial in the battles to come. In addition to the Astartes, the defenders included over 1.5 million soldiers of the Imperial army, 3 loyal Titan legions, the Adeptus Custodes, the Sisters of Silence, and whatever other forces could be gathered before the storm hit. On the 13th day of Secundus, the bombardment began. From orbit, Horus's ships laid down an unrelenting barrage of missiles and energy beams. At the traitor fleet, striking from positions around Mars, which had already fallen to the traitors, managed to destroy the vast Imperial defenses on Luna, smash Terra's orbital defenses, and scatter the protecting Loyalist fleet over the course of 30 days of brutal space combat. The orbital bombardment was some of the most intense ever witnessed, shaking even the most hardened veterans among the Loyalist Space Marines. However, what's damage to the Imperial Palace itself was minimized by the sophisticated multi-layered and self-repairing void shield system known as the Aegis, as well as Terra's last orbital plate, which had been positioned over the palace to serve as both shield and gun platform. When the bombardment reached a crescendo, waves of traitor drop pods and transport ships were launched from the orbiting fleet. Many were destroyed by Loyalist defense lasers, aircraft, and missile silos. But many more made it through. From these burst the warriors of the traitor legions, World Eaters and Death Guard, Emperor's Children and Word-Bearers and Thousand Sons, along with elements of the Sons of Horus and Iron Warriors. Each bore the mark of their allegiance to the Dark Gods, their once noble armor defaced with blasphemous symbols and stained with the blood of worlds they had conquered on their long march to Terra. While the traitors' first objective was to silence Terra's defense guns and capture the planet's primary spaceports. Across the wide plateau surrounding the Imperial Palace, 100 or more battles erupted simultaneously as the traitors launched their assaults. The fighting was savage beyond description. Space Marines, who had once fought side by side as brothers, now turned their bolters and chainswords against each other with a hatred that transcended anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. From the Eternity Wall, Spaceport and the Lion's Gate Spaceport fell within hours to an overwhelming assault led by the World Eaters under Angron, now a fully ascended demon prince of Khorne. With the landing fields in his hands, Horus was able to bring down his heaviest assets, including the terrible Chaos Titans that strode through the ruins like walking nightmares, their machine spirits corrupted by demonic possession. Within a few scant hours, the traitor forces had seized control of both major spaceports and killed tens of thousands of loyalist warriors. Supported by Titans and overwhelming numbers of traitorous forces, the traitor armies managed to surround the Imperial Palace's entire circumference. The siege that followed lasted 55 days, and every one of those days was a hell beyond mortal comprehension. Angron and his World Eaters hammered at the walls with berserk fury, demon engines screaming alongside them. Mortarion and the Death Guard attacked near the Saturnine Gate, turning the previously lavish Palatine Arc into an infected quagmire that the defenders nicknamed Poxville, its streets running with pestilence, and its air thick with the stench of Nurgle's blessings. The biological weapons deployed by the Death Guard were unlike anything the defenders had encountered before. Plagues that could eat through ceramite armor, contagions that turned living flesh into blooming gardens of fungus and rot, but diseases that did not merely kill their victims but transformed them, turning loyal soldiers into shambling plague bearers that attacked their former comrades with mindless fury. The defenders who held the Saturnine Gate fought not just against an enemy army, but against the corruption of biology itself. Every breath a risk, every wound a potential death sentence, not from blood loss, but from the endless catalogue of pestilence that Mortarion's legion carried in their rotting flesh. Her Perturabo and the Iron Warriors, master siege engineers, methodically dismantled the outer defences with cold, calculated precision, their artillery batteries never ceasing their thunder. Where Angron's World Eaters attacked with berserker fury, throwing themselves at the walls in blood-maddened charges, and where Mortarion's Death Guard advanced with inexorable patience, letting their diseases do the killing before they even fired a shot. Perturabo approached the siege as a mathematical problem to be solved. He studied the angles of fire from the palace's gun emplacements. He calculated the stress tolerances of the walls. He identified the weakest points in the overlapping fields of fire and directed his attacks with surgical precision, grinding the defenses down meter by meter, day by day. If Angron was a hammer and Mortarion was a slow poison, Perturabo was a scalpel, and between the three of them, they were cutting the Imperial Palace to pieces. The Emperor's children under Fulgrim launched raids to the west and north, but their commitment to the siege was half-hearted at best. Already they were beginning to descend into the depravity that would define them for millennia to come, abandoning the front lines to hunt among the civilian population of Terra for victims to satisfy their twisted desires. The Emperor's psychic shield held strong enough to keep the demon Primarchs from entering the palace itself, a barrier of pure willpower projected from the golden throne that burned the essence of any warp-spawned creature that attempted to cross it. But this shield came at a terrible cost. The Emperor was locked in a constant psychic war with the Chaos Gods themselves, a battle fought simultaneously in the material world and in the dimension of the Imperium. And every moment that passed drained his strength further. As the siege ground on, the situation grew more desperate. Magnus the Red launched psychic assaults against the Emperor's shield, aided by cabal of sorcerers from the Thousand Suns. At Horus's command, both he and Magnus attacked the Emperor's mind directly, seeking to weaken the barrier enough for the demon hordes to breach the palace. And they very nearly succeeded. As the Emperor's shield contracted, is reducing in size to cover only the inner sanctum, demons began to manifest on Terra's soil in numbers not seen since the ancient wars of the Old Ones. Inside the palace, the situation was equally dire. Chaos cultists who had infiltrated Terra's population before the siege began conducted mass sacrifices, thinning the barriers between reality and the warp, and calling forth greater demons onto Terran soil. The defenders fought not just against traitor space marines and mortal soldiers, but against creatures born from pure malice and given form by the dark energies of the warp. Sanguinius, the angel of the blood angels, became the symbol of the defense. When Angron appeared before the walls and demanded the defenders' surrender, it was Sanguinius who stood atop the Eternity Gate and defied him. When the mighty bloodthirster Kabanda, a greater demon of Khorne, came forth and challenged the angel to single combat, Sanguinius answered. The two clashed in the air above the heads of both armies, trading blows that shook the walls of the palace. Sanguinius, already exhausted from weeks of constant battle, was struck down, his body cratering the concrete upon impact. But the Primarch rose. He seized the demon and lifted it above his head, breaking its back across his knee, before hurling the creature's ruined form back into the ranks of the besiegers. The demon's spirit was banished back to the warp for 1,000 years, and the defenders' spirits were bolstered, even as the walls crumbled around them. Meanwhile, the White Scars under Jagatai Khan refused to fight a purely defensive war. While the traitor army hammered at the palace walls, the Khan led his warriors in a series of devastating hit-and-run attacks against the enemy's flanks and rear columns, harrying supply lines, disrupting communications, and launching lightning raids that kept the traitors off balance. In one particularly daring operation, as the Khan led a nighttime raid to retake the Lion's Gate spaceport, a gambit that succeeded in temporarily cutting off the traitor forces from their orbital supply chain. But all of this was merely the prelude. The true confrontation, the moment upon which the fate of humanity would be decided, was yet to come. 55 days. That is how long the defenders held. 55 days of constant bombardment, of wave after wave of traitor assaults. Of demons pouring through cracks in reality, and cultists murdering civilians in blood rituals designed to weaken the barriers between the material universe and the warp. 55 days of blood and fire, and the slow, grinding erosion of everything the defenders had built. By the end, the Loyalists had been forced back to the Eternity Gate itself, the last point of entry into the inner sanctum of the Imperial Palace. Blood Angels and Imperial Fists fought side by side to hold the gate, their bolters and blades slick with the blood of traitors and demons alike, while the remaining defenders filed through the gate behind them. The walls of the outer palace had fallen. The spaceports had changed hands multiple times. The beautiful architecture that the Emperor had once commissioned to celebrate humanity's achievement had been reduced to rubble and ash. And then Horus made his move. Whether it was a moment of genuine regret, a personal challenge to his father, or simply a tactical decision born of desperation, Horus lowered the void shields of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, a massive warship that orbited Terra like a baleful eye. The traitors were running out of time. Reports indicated that Loyalist reinforcements, including the Ultramarines under Guilliman and the Dark Angels under the Lion, were approaching the Sol system. If they arrived before the palace fell, the siege would fail and the traitor forces would be caught between two armies. The Emperor detected the lowered shields and recognized the opportunity and perhaps the trap that Horus was offering. He gathered his most trusted warriors, Sanguinius, the Angel, Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian, the Adeptus Custodes, his Golden Guardians, companies of Imperial Fists and Blood Angels veterans. Together, they teleported from the palace to the deck of the Vengeful Spirit in a desperate last gambit. What happened aboard that ship has become the most legendary and the most debated event in Imperial history. The teleportation scattered the Emperor's force throughout the massive warship, as Horus used his chaos-fueled powers to disrupt their arrival. Separated from his father, Sanguinius fought his way through the ship alone, cutting down traitors and demons with his great sword, seeking out Horus. He found the War Master on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, and there, the Angel faced his brother for the last time. Sanguinius knew he would die. He had foreseen his own death in visions that had haunted him for years, yet he did not hesitate. He fought Horus with everything he had, his wings spread wide, his blade singing, his fury and his grief and his love for his fallen brother pouring into every strike. But Horus, swollen with the combined power of 4 chaos gods, was beyond anything that even a Primarch could overcome alone. Sanguinius fell, broken by the War Master's hand, and the Emperor arrived to find his most beloved son lying dead at the feet of his most treacherous one. The battle that followed was fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously, a conflict so vast and so terrible that mortal minds struggle to comprehend it. The Emperor and Horus clashed in the material world, their weapons ringing against each other with force enough to crack the hull of the ship. But they also fought in the Imperium, in the warp, where the Chaos Gods watched and screamed and poured their power into their champion. The battle manifested across time and space, through memories and possibilities, through past and future. It was not merely a duel between father and son. It was a war between two visions of reality, between the Emperor's dream of a rational, ordered galaxy and the Chaos God's desire for an eternity of suffering and corruption. But the details of how the Emperor ultimately prevailed remain shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts. What is known is that Horus was slain, his body broken, the corruption of chaos burned from his flesh in his final moments. Some accounts say that the Emperor, despite his grievous injuries, was able to reach through the layers of chaos that had consumed his son and find a spark of the man Horus had once been, and that it was Horus himself, freed from the Dark God's grip for one last instant, and who asked his father to end it. Other accounts are less kind, suggesting that the Emperor destroyed Horus so utterly that there was nothing left for even the Chaos Gods to reclaim. But the cost was beyond measure. The Emperor was mortally wounded, his body shattered, his mind fractured by the effort of combating both Horus and the four Chaos Gods simultaneously. Rogel Dawn found his father's broken form and carried it back to Terra, where the Emperor was placed upon the Golden Throne. The ancient device, originally designed to maintain a portal into the webway, was hastily modified into a life support system. The Emperor's consciousness retreated into the Imperium, where it would project the Astronomicon and wage an eternal war against the Chaos Gods on their own plane. He has not spoken since. He has not moved since. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has sat upon the Golden Throne, a corpse that is not quite dead, but sustained by technology that is slowly failing, and by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, whose life force is consumed to power the Astronomicon and the psychic wards that protect Terra from demonic incursion. The scene in the Sanctum Imperialis, if you could somehow witness it, would be one of the most haunting sights in the galaxy. The chamber itself is almost 4 miles long and half a mile high, a space so vast that weather patterns form within it. Clouds of alchemical fog swirling around the machinery that climbs toward the distant ceiling, like a mountain range of pipes and cables and arcane mechanisms. At the center, atop this mountain of technology, sits the Golden Throne itself, and upon it, the Emperor, or what remains of him. He is not the golden giant that the propaganda picts show. He is not the magnificent warrior who strode across the battlefields of the Great Crusade. He is a corpse, a withered, desiccated thing. Barely recognizable as human, his flesh stretched tight over bones that should have crumbled to dust millennia ago. Tubes and cables pierce his body at 1,000 points, feeding nutrients and chemicals into what little living tissue remains, drawing away waste products, monitoring the barely perceptible electrical impulses that pass for life signs. Around him, the machinery hums and throbs with a heartbeat that is not quite mechanical and not quite organic, as a sound that the custodians who stand watch over him have listened to for 10,000 years without ever growing accustomed to it. Along the walls of the throne room, thousands of coffin-like devices are connected to the Golden Throne by a web of cables and psychic conduits. Within each coffin lies a psyker, a human being born with the ability to touch the warp with their mind, whose life force is being slowly drained to power the Astronomicon. Each psyker lasts only a few days before their essence is consumed entirely, their body reduced to a hollow shell that is removed and replaced with a fresh sacrifice. 1,000 psychers a day, 365,000 a year. Over 10,000 years, the number of souls sacrificed to sustain the Emperor defies comprehension. This is the price of survival. This is what it costs to keep the Astronomicon burning, to maintain the psychic wards that protect Terra. Untold closed the webway portal that the Emperor sealed with his own will during the heresy. Without this sacrifice, the Imperium falls. With it, the Imperium endures, but at a cost that makes the word salvation taste like ashes in the mouth.
Now, before we keep going, I just want to take a second here because this part of the lore generally hits different for me. The fall of Cadia is one of those moments where Games Workshop actually committed to pushing the story forward, and I remember the first time I read through it thinking there's no way they actually destroyed it. Cadia was supposed to be this immovable thing, this permanent fixture of the setting. And when Abaddon just drops a fortress from orbit onto it because he couldn't win the ground war, it felt earned. It felt real in a way that a lot of 40k moments don't always land. And honestly, the fact that the planet broke before the guard did is still one of the hardest lines in all of Warhammer. But anyway, let us go back to the video.
Chaos had reached Terra. It had breached the walls of the palace. It had killed a Primarch, wounded an Emperor, and brought the Imperium to the very brink of annihilation. But it had not won. Horus was dead, and with his death, as the cohesion of the traitor forces collapsed, the remaining traitor legions fled Terra in disarray, pursued by the loyalists in what would become known as the Great Scouring. Eventually, the traitors were driven into the Eye of Terra, a massive warp rift where the immaterium and real space overlapped, and there they would remain, plotting and scheming and hating for the next 10,000 years. But the damage was done. The Emperor's dream was shattered. The Imperium that rose from the ashes of the heresy was not the rational, enlightened civilization the Emperor had envisioned. It was a brutal theocracy, powered by fear and sustained by an endless war machine. Its people kept in ignorance and its enemies held at bay by nothing more than the sheer, stubborn refusal to die. The Emperor, who had explicitly forbidden his followers from worshipping him as a god, became the centerpiece of the most powerful religion in human history. And the irony of this was perhaps the cruelest joke the Chaos Gods ever played. And on Terra, the wards were restored. The Emperor's psychic presence, even diminished as it was enough to make the throne world proof against demonic incursion. Demons could not set foot on Terra without being destroyed by the Emperor's power. The planet that had nearly fallen was made safe again, shielded by the will of a dying god who refused to let go. For 10,000 years, that shield held. And for 10,000 years, the enemies of mankind dreamed of breaking it. The 10 millennia that followed the Horus heresy are often referred to as the Long War, and it is a name that barely captures the scale of the conflict. For 10,000 years, the Imperium and the forces of chaos have been locked in a struggle that spans the entire galaxy, a war of attrition that grinds forward with merciless, unending purpose. On Terra itself, the defenses were rebuilt and expanded, as the Imperial Palace, already the mightiest fortress in human history, was further fortified in the wake of the heresy. The scars of the siege were not all repaired. Some were deliberately left in place as reminders of the cost of complacency, of the price of betrayal. The Adeptus Custodes, once 10,000 strong, had been reduced to barely 1,000 survivors by the heresy. Over the following millennia, as they rebuilt their numbers and settled into their new role as the eternal guardians of the Emperor and his palace. The Custodes are not space marines. They are something older, something more individually crafted. Where space marines are mass-produced superhuman soldiers, each custodian is a unique work of bioengineering, created using methods known only to the Emperor himself. They are faster, stronger, more intelligent and more durable than even the finest space marine. And they are utterly devoted to the protection of the Emperor above all other considerations. For most of the 10,000 years following the heresy, the Custodes rarely left the palace, and even more rarely left Terra. Their role was singular: to stand guard over the Golden Throne and ensure that no threat, internal or external, could reach the Emperor. Alongside the Custodes, the Sisters of Silence served as a vital component of Terra's defense. These warrior women are all psychic blanks. They are individuals with a rare genetic trait that creates a null zone around them, suppressing psychic phenomena and making them devastating weapons against psykers and demons alike. Their presence on Terra was essential for maintaining the psychic defenses of the throne world and for hunting down the chaos cults that inevitably sprouted among Terra's teeming population. But Terra's defenses extended far beyond the palace itself. The Sol system was ringed with defensive installations, from orbital weapons platforms to fortress worlds to minefields that could destroy entire fleets. Luna remained a massive defensive bastion, its planetary defense lasers capable of engaging enemy warships at extreme range. Mars, restored to Imperial control after the heresy, served as the heart of the Adeptus Mechanicus, its forge worlds churning out weapons and war machines in quantities that staggered the imagination. The Imperial Navy maintained permanent patrol fleets in the Sol system, and multiple Space Marine chapters had fortresses or recruiting worlds within easy reach of Terra. The defenses of the throne world were further enhanced by something less tangible but far more powerful than any wall or weapon: the Emperor's psychic presence. From his position on the Golden Throne, the Emperor projected wards across Terra that made the planet almost impervious to demonic incursion. Before the siege of Terra, it had been impossible for demons to set foot on the throne world without being destroyed. After the heresy, those wards were restored, and for 10,000 years they held firm. The very soil of Terra was anathema to the creatures of the warp, and any demon foolish enough to manifest on the throne world would find itself burning away like ice in a furnace. This combination of physical fortification, military force, and psychic protection made Terra the most heavily defended world in the galaxy, while the very idea of attacking the planet was considered absurd by most Imperial officials. The throne world had survived the worst the galaxy could throw at it during the heresy, and the defenses had only grown stronger in the millennia since. Whoever would dare to assault Terra would need to command forces on a scale not seen since Horus himself had marshaled the traitor legions. And yet, the threats never stopped coming. In the 32nd millennium, barely 500 years after the heresy, what a threat emerged from an unexpected quarter. The Orcs, those green-skinned savages that most Imperial commanders dismissed as a mere nuisance, united under a war boss of unprecedented intelligence and power, known only as the Beast. The resulting conflict, known as the War of the Beast, was the largest military campaign fought by the Imperium since the heresy itself. The Beast's forces were not the disorganized rabble that the Imperium was accustomed to fighting. These were highly disciplined and technologically advanced orcs who fought with a cunning and coordination that mirrored the tactics of the Space Marines themselves. They wielded weapons that surpassed anything in the Imperial arsenal, including massive battle stations called attack moons, hollowed-out planetoids, outfitted with gravity weapons capable of destroying entire worlds. The Beast's armies swept across the Imperium, overrunning entire sectors, and eventually an attack moon materialized in orbit over Terra itself. The War of the Beast brought the Imperium to its knees. The Imperial Fists chapter was nearly wiped out. The High Lords of Terra descended into political infighting at the worst possible moment. The citizenry of Terra, witnessing an alien war machine hanging in their sky like a second moon, erupted into panic. A desperate civilian crusade, the Proletarian Crusade, was launched to assault the attack moon and was annihilated almost to the last man. Only the return of the Primarch Vulcan, miraculously alive after his apparent death during the heresy, and a series of desperate campaigns on the Orc homeworld of Ulanor finally brought the Beast's rampage to an end. The War of the Beast was a wake-up call. It demonstrated that Terra was not as invulnerable as the High Lords liked to believe, and that threats could emerge from directions that no one anticipated. But the lesson, like so many lessons in the Imperium's history, was only partially learned. the defenses were rebuilt. The political structure was reorganized, and the Imperium settled back into its familiar pattern of complacency and bureaucratic inertia. And in the Eye of Terror, the traitor legions watched and waited and continued their own preparations for the day when they would return. But the War of the Beast left scars on Terra that went deeper than the physical damage. The political structures of the Imperium had been exposed as rotten and dysfunctional. The High Lords of Terra, those 12 individuals who collectively governed the Imperium in the Emperor's name, had spent more time fighting among themselves for political advantage than actually addressing the crisis. Entire chapters of Space Marines had been nearly destroyed. The Imperial Fists, the chapter that bore the most direct responsibility for the defense of Terra, had been reduced to a single surviving member, a captain named Corland, who had to rally the successor chapters to mount a defense. The War of the Beast also demonstrated something that the Imperium preferred not to think about. Terra was dependent on the rest of the galaxy for its survival. The Throne World's population was so vast, and its resource base so limited, that it required constant imports of food, water, raw materials, and manufactured goods from other worlds simply to sustain itself. If those supply lines were cut, even for a relatively short period, the results would be catastrophic. Starvation, disease, civil unrest, and eventually outright social collapse would follow in short order. The fortress of the Imperium was also its most vulnerable point, a paradox that the High Lords had never found a satisfactory way to resolve. Other threats tested Terra's defenses over the millennia. Eldar raiders penetrated the Imperial Palace's outer defenses on at least one occasion. The Age of Apostasy in the 36th millennium saw the Imperium tear itself apart in a civil war that, while not directly threatening Terra with military conquest, demonstrated how easily the Throne World's political system could be corrupted from within. The madman, Goge Vandire, who somehow managed to seize control of both the ecclesiarchy and the administratum, turned the Imperium into his personal fiefdom, and only the intervention of the Adeptus Custodes, who used their knowledge of secret passages within the Imperial Palace to bring the truth of Vandire's treachery to his own bodyguards, brought the crisis to an end. Each of these events chipped away at the illusion of Terran invincibility. Each one revealed weaknesses that the Imperium's enemies could exploit. And each one was eventually overcome, the wounds patched, the defenses repaired, the narrative adjusted to reassure the population that everything was fine, that the Emperor protected, that Terra was safe. But nothing lasts forever, not even comforting lies. And in the Eye of Terror, a being of extraordinary patience was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would shatter every one of those lies once and for all. Abaddon the Despoiler. The name has become a curse in the Imperium, a word spoken in whispers and dread by those who know the history of the Long War. He was once Ezekal Abaddon, first captain of the Sons of Horus, the most favored warrior of the Warmaster himself. When Horus fell aboard the Vengeful Spirit, it was Abaddon who took up the mantle of leadership over the shattered traitor legions. When the traitors were driven into the Eye of Terror during the Great Scouring, it was Abaddon who refused to accept defeat, who forged a new identity for the Legion, renaming them the Black Legion, and who began the long, patient work of rebuilding the forces of chaos into something capable of finishing what Horus had begun. But Abaddon was not simply another warlord seeking glory and power, and he was something far more dangerous. A strategist of extraordinary cunning, capable of thinking in terms of millennia rather than decades. While lesser champions fought among themselves for scraps of territory within the Eye of Terror, Abaddon conceived a plan of breathtaking ambition, a plan that would span 13 separate military campaigns and 10,000 years of patient, methodical execution. He called it the Crimson Path. The Crimson Path was not merely a military strategy, as it was a grand ritual, a design etched into the fabric of reality itself. Abaddon understood something that the Imperium strategists did not, that across the galaxy, ancient monoliths and structures of mysterious origin, many of them crafted from a substance called blackstone, were holding back the tides of the warp. These structures, some of them predating humanity itself, served as anchors that kept the boundary between real space and the immaterium intact. If enough of these anchors were destroyed, the barrier between the two dimensions would weaken catastrophically, allowing the power of chaos to flood into the material universe on a scale never before witnessed. Each of Abaddon's Black Crusades, those terrifying military campaigns in which the normally fractious forces of chaos united under his command and launched massive attacks against the Imperium, served a specific purpose within this grand design. And some were massive invasions that ravaged entire sectors. Others were smaller, more focused operations aimed at destroying specific targets or acquiring specific artifacts. To the Imperium, the Black Crusades appeared to be the frustrated rampages of a warlord who could never quite achieve his goals. Abaddon was mocked by some as the despoiler who always fails, a joke that persisted through the ranks of Imperial command for millennia. The joke was on them. The truth, which the Imperium would not understand for 10,000 years, is that Abaddon was not failing. He was succeeding, one step at a time, at a pace so slow that no mortal strategist could perceive the pattern. Each Black Crusade moved the Crimson Path a little further along its course, each target destroyed, each pylon shattered, each Blackstone structure reduced to rubble. All weakened the barrier between dimensions by an increment so small that it was undetectable on any individual occasion, but devastating in its cumulative effect. Consider the patience required for such a plan. Abaddon is not a demon, immortal and timeless. He is, or was, a space marine, a being of flesh and blood, albeit enhanced beyond the human norm. He has survived for 10,000 years through a combination of the time-distorting effects of the Eye of Terra, or where centuries can pass in what feels like days, and through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. He has endured defeat after defeat, humiliation after humiliation, watching as lesser champions mocked him and greater powers dismissed him. And through it all, he held to his plan, knowing that the final move was still millennia away, but trusting that the mathematics of destruction would eventually add up. This is what makes Abaddon so dangerous. Not his raw power, though he is one of the most formidable individual warriors in the galaxy. Not his armies, though he commands forces that dwarf those of any other Chaos warlord. But his patience, his strategic vision, his ability to think in timescales that would break the minds of lesser beings, and to maintain a coherent plan across millennia of seemingly random violence. The First Black Crusade, launched in 781 of the 31st millennium, was Abaddon's announcement that the traitor legions had returned. During this campaign, he descended to the Tower of Silence and claimed the demon sword, Draknien, a weapon of prodigious power that would become his signature instrument of destruction. The Second Black Crusade targeted Cardia directly, testing the defenses of the Imperium's primary bulwark against chaos incursions from the Eye of Terra. The Third unleashed a demon prince against the Cadian Gate as a distraction, while Abaddon desecrated the tomb of St. Gerstal on a distant shrine world. And so it continued, crusade after crusade, each one serving a purpose that the Imperium could not perceive. The Fifth Black Crusade summoned the demon prince Doombreed and destroyed 2 entire Space Marine chapters. The Seventh claimed the gene seed of blood angels slaughtered at the world of Makan. The Eighth appeased Tzeentch with an elaborate mathematical sequence of death. The 12th Black Crusade, known as the Gothic War, was one of Abaddon's most significant campaigns. During this conflict, which raged across the Gothic sector for over 20 years, Abaddon captured several of the mysterious alien artifacts known to the Imperium as Blackstone fortresses. These Blackstone fortresses were of incalculable value. Ancient, beyond reckoning, created by a species that predated humanity by millions of years, they possessed the ability to generate beams of energy powerful enough to destroy stars. More importantly for Abaddon's purposes, they were made from the same mysterious substance, our Blackstone, as the pylons and monoliths that held back the warp. In Abaddon's hands, they could be used as weapons of both physical destruction and metaphysical sabotage. Throughout these crusades, Abaddon was not merely fighting battles. He was systematically destroying the structures that held reality together, weakening the barrier between the material universe and the immaterium along a specific path, a path that led from the Eye of Terra directly toward the Soul System. As the Crimson Path was being carved into the fabric of reality itself, and with each Black Crusade, it grew longer and wider and more impossible to close. And all of it, every crusade, every battle, every sacrifice, and every scheme, was leading toward one ultimate goal. The 13th Black Crusade. The final push. The campaign that would shatter the Cadian Gate, break the barrier between dimensions, and open the road to Terra once and for all. The Imperium had 10,000 years to see it coming. They never did. Cadia. The name alone carries the weight of a world's sacrifice and a galaxy's failure. Cadia was the fortress world, the planet that stood at the mouth of the only stable route out of the Eye of Terra, the gateway through which the forces of chaos had to pass if they wished to reach the wider galaxy. For 10,000 years, the Cadian Gate had held, defended by the most elite soldiers in the Imperial Guard, as warriors born and bred for war on a world where every child learned to fire a lasgun before they could read. The Cadian shock troops were legendary throughout the Imperium, raised on a planet where the sky itself was tinged with the baleful light of the Eye of Terra, where chaos incursions were not theoretical threats but daily realities. The Cadians were among the finest conventional soldiers humanity had ever produced. Their planet was honeycombed with fortifications. Their orbital defenses were formidable, and their ground forces were supported by batteries of basilisk artillery, squadrons of Lehman Russ tanks, and the constant vigilance of Space Marine chapters who maintained garrisons in the surrounding sectors. But Cadia's true strength was not in its soldiers or its fortifications. Beneath the planet's surface lay a network of ancient pylons, structures of unknown origin that predated human colonization of the world by millions of years. These pylons, and constructed from Blackstone by the ancient Necrons, served a function that the Imperium did not fully understand. They held back the Eye of Terra itself, preventing the massive warp rift from expanding beyond its current boundaries. Without the pylons, the Eye of Terra would have consumed the entire Cadian system, and perhaps much more besides. Abaddon understood this. He had spent 10,000 years understanding this, and the 13th Black Crusade was his masterstroke. In 999 of the 41st Millennium, Abaddon launched the largest mobilization of Chaos forces since the Horus Heresy. Every traitor legion contributed forces. Demon princes led their warbands out of the Eye of Terror. Chaos titans strode alongside hordes of cultists and mutants. The Dark Mechanicum fielded its blasphemous war machines. Demons manifested in numbers that defied comprehension. And at the center of it all, Abaddon himself, wielding Drachnian in one hand and the Talon of Horus in the other, led the Black Legion in a direct assault on the Cadian system. The defense of Cadia was heroic beyond measure. Lord Castellan Ursarkar Creed, perhaps the greatest tactical mind in the Imperial Guard, orchestrated a defense that should have been impossible. Wave after wave of chaos forces broke upon the Cadian lines, and wave after wave was repelled. But the Cadian shock troops fought with a ferocity born of 10,000 years of genetic and cultural conditioning for exactly this moment. Space Marine chapters arrived to reinforce the defense. Even the mysterious Aeldari lent their aid, recognizing that the fall of Cadia would threaten not just the Imperium, but all sentient life in the galaxy. The battles on Cadia's surface were of an intensity that defied description. As in the trenches and fortifications that surrounded the planet's great Kassar cities, Cadian soldiers fought with a discipline and determination that would have made any commander in Imperial history proud. They held their lines against berserkers from the World Eaters, who charged headlong into overlapping fields of fire, soaking up lasgun shots by the hundred before finally going down. They endured the creeping horror of Death Guard advances, where soldiers ahead of the advancing Plague Marines began to sicken and die from diseases that no medici could identify, let alone treat. They fought sorcerers of the Thousand Suns who turned the very ground beneath the defenders' feet to quicksand, or ignited the air itself with psychic fire. Creed's tactical genius was the linchpin of the defense. Time and again, he anticipated Abaddon's moves and positioned his forces to counter them. Or when the traitors attempted to flank the primary defense lines through the Cadian interior, they found regiment after regiment of shock troops already dug in and waiting for them. When Chaos Titans advanced against the planetary defense batteries, Creed had super-heavy tanks positioned in concealed firing positions to engage them. The Lord Castellan seemed to be everywhere at once, in his presence on the front lines inspiring his soldiers to feats of valor that pushed beyond the limits of what anyone thought possible. But Abaddon had not come to fight a fair battle. He had come to destroy a world. When his conventional military forces could not break the Cadian lines, Abaddon unleashed his contingency plan. The Blackstone fortress known as the Will of Eternity, one of the ancient alien artifacts he had captured during the Gothic War, when it was hurled from orbit directly at Cardia's surface. The impact was catastrophic. The kinetic force of a planetoid-sized object striking the surface shattered the Cadian pylons, those ancient Necron structures that had held back the Eye of Terra for millions of years, and the destruction cascaded across the planet. Imagine what it was like for the defenders on the ground. You have fought for weeks, maybe months, in the most intense combat you have ever experienced. You have watched friends die. You have killed enemies by the score. You have held your line against overwhelming odds, driven by the knowledge that if Cadia falls, the gate falls. And if the gate falls, the road to Terra lies open. And you held. Against everything the despoiler threw at you, you held. Your laser gun is almost empty, your body is broken, but you held. And then you look up and see a moon falling from the sky. The Will of Eternity, damaged but still massive, descended upon Cadia like the fist of an angry god. The impact shook the entire planet. Seismic waves rippled outward from the strike zone, toppling fortifications and burying defenders alive under tons of rubble. The pylons, those mysterious structures that had stood for eons, cracked and shattered under the force of the impact, and with each one that failed, the sky seemed to change, the sickly light of the Eye of Terror growing brighter and more malevolent. The pylons did not simply stop working. When they broke, and the barrier they had maintained broke with them, the Eye of Terror, that massive wound in reality where the warp and real space overlapped, began to expand. Within hours, most of Cadia was being consumed by the Imperium. The surviving Imperial forces evacuated what they could, harried by Chaos warships, and watched helplessly as the planet they had defended for 10 millennia tore itself apart. Cadia fell. The gate was open. And what followed was something that no living being in the galaxy had ever witnessed before. The Great Rift, known in the formal High Gothic as the Cicatrix Maledictum, tore across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe. It was not merely a warp storm. It was a galaxy-spanning wound in reality itself, a chain of overlapping warp rifts that divided the Milky Way in two, spilling the raw stuff of the Immaterium into real space on a scale that made the Eye of Terror look like a puddle compared to an ocean. No one fully understands how the Great Rift formed. The destruction of the Cadian pylons was certainly a contributing factor, but it was not the only one. Some scholars point to the sorcery of Magnus the Red during the siege of the Fenris system. Others suggest that the awakening of the Aeldari death god Inead played a role, or that mass bloodshed in the Damocles Gulf added fuel to the fire. Gilliman himself has speculated that Abaddon's destruction of Blackstone-rich worlds over the course of 10,000 years, culminating in the destruction of Cadia, created a chain reaction that was always going to produce this result. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors, a convergence of catastrophes that, when they came together, produced an effect greater than the sum of its parts, as the effects of the Great Rift were immediate and devastating. So powerful was the psychic shockwave that accompanied its birth that the very laws of physics began to fray at its edges. Time itself became unreliable. Some worlds felt centuries pass in what their clocks measured as days. Others were frozen, their populations trapped in moments that stretched into apparent eternities. Still others experienced time flowing backwards or looping, or fracturing into multiple simultaneous timelines that contradicted each other. The warp had always been a place where time had no meaning, but now that unreliability was spilling into the material universe, and reality itself was becoming negotiable. The Imperium was split in half. On one side, the Imperium Sanctus, where the light of the Astronomicon still shone, and some semblance of order could be maintained. On the other, the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, was where the Astronomicon's light was blocked by the Great Rift and entire sectors were cut off from Terra, from communication, from any hope of reinforcement. Worlds that had been loyal to the Emperor for millennia were suddenly alone in the dark, surrounded by enemies and unable to call for help. From the Great Rift poured the forces of chaos in numbers not seen since the heresy itself. Demon worlds materialized in real space. Warp storms engulfed entire sectors. Yet the armies of the dark gods rampaged across both halves of the Imperium, conquering worlds, corrupting populations, and spreading the influence of the ruinous powers deeper into the material universe than they had ever reached before. And Terra, the seat of the Imperium, the throne world of mankind, found itself not in the midst of this catastrophe, but terrifyingly close to its edge. The Great Rift did not pass directly through the Sol system. But it came close enough that its effects were devastating. Warp storms raged through nearby systems. Communication with the wider Imperium was disrupted or severed entirely. The Astronomicon, that vital psychic beacon, flickered and faltered under the pressure of the Empyrean energies being released. Abaddon's crimson path was complete. The road to Terra was open, and in the darkness that followed, something ancient and terrible stirred, fixing its burning gaze upon the throne world and preparing to do what no force had done since the heresy. Chaos was coming to Terra. Again, the period immediately following the birth of the Great Rift was known as the Noctis Eterna, the Days of Blinding, and it was perhaps the most terrifying time that the Imperium had experienced since the heresy itself. On Terra, the Astronomicon failed entirely for 33 days. On 33 days in which the psychic beacon that guided humanity's ships through the warp went completely dark. And no one, not the highest Martian tech priests, not the most powerful psychers in the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, not even the High Lords of Terra themselves, could determine why. Think about what that means. For 33 days, Terra was blind. Ships could not navigate. Astropathic communication, as the telepathic message system that held the Imperium together across the vast distances of space, was disrupted or impossible. The throne world, the center of an empire that spanned 1,000,000 worlds, was cut off from everything beyond its own system. Reports that did filter through were garbled, contradictory, and terrifying. Cardia had fallen. A great wound had torn across the sky. Worlds were being consumed. The Imperium was splitting apart, and on Terra itself, though the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The overcrowded hive cities that pressed against the palace walls were tinderboxes of desperation, even in the best of times, filled with billions of people living in conditions of crushing poverty, constant surveillance, and perpetual fear. When word spread that Cardia had fallen, when the Astronomicon went dark, and the sky itself seemed to change, tinted with the baleful colors of the warp, the thin veneer of order cracked and shattered. As starvation was the first catalyst. Terra had always been dependent on imports from other worlds to feed its massive population. With warp travel disrupted, supply shipments stopped arriving. Food reserves dwindled. Rationing was imposed, then tightened again. In the lower levels of the hive cities, where the poorest and most desperate of Terra's population eked out their miserable existences, people began to starve. Desperation made fertile ground for chaos cults. But these organizations had always existed on Terra, lurking in the shadows beneath the gaze of the Inquisition and the Adeptus Arbites. whispering promises of salvation and power to those who had nothing left to lose. Now, with the established order crumbling and fear spreading like wildfire, the cults emerged from hiding and began to recruit openly. Preachers of the dark gods stood on street corners and in hab-block corridors, offering food, protection, and the promise of a new order to anyone who would kneel before the ruinous powers. The authorities responded with the blunt instruments that the Imperium had always favored: mass arrests, summary executions, entire hab-blocks sealed and purged with fire. But the scale of the problem was beyond what the Arbites could handle. The Inquisition, that vast and secretive organization charged with protecting the Imperium from internal threats, deployed its agents across Terra. But they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of cults that had sprouted in the chaos. The Adeptus Custodes, those golden guardians of the Emperor, found themselves fighting a war on two fronts. On one hand, they had to maintain the security of the Imperial Palace, ensuring that no cult or conspiracy could penetrate its defenses and reach the Golden Throne. On the other, they had to venture out into the hive cities to combat the most dangerous of the chaos incursions. As leading kill teams of Grey Knights and Sisters of Silence into the labyrinthine tunnels and warrens where the cultists had established their strongholds. Captain General Trajan Valoris, the leader of the Adeptus Custodes and one of the most formidable warriors in the Imperium, recognized that the situation on Terra was spiraling out of control. The traditional approach of containment and concealment was no longer viable. The cults were too numerous, too well organized, and too deeply embedded in the population to be eliminated quietly. Worse still, the cultists were not merely recruiting and proselytizing. They were conducting sacrificial rituals, mass murders designed to thin the barrier between real space and the warp, to weaken the wards that the Emperor's presence maintained over Terra. At the behest of the inquisitorial representative, Cleopatra Arx, the High Lords of Terra issued what became known as the Arx Doctrine, a directive that essentially ceded large portions of Terra to mob rule while concentrating the remaining Imperial forces around the palace, the Forbidden Fortress, and other strategically vital structures. It was an acknowledgement of a terrible reality. The Imperium could not hold all of Terra. Roughly a quarter of the planet was temporarily lost to anarchy, its hive cities becoming war zones where chaos cultists, desperate civilians, and Imperial security forces fought a vicious three-way war in the cramped corridors and polluted underhives. And all of this was happening in the darkness. Without the Astronomicon, without reliable communication with the wider Imperium, the High Lords did not know if help was coming, did not know if the Imperium still existed beyond the Sol system, did not know if they were fighting the opening battles of a final siege, or merely weathering a storm that would pass. The uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest weapon of all, and it gnawed at the resolve of even the most steadfast defenders. Then, after 20 days of darkness, something unexpected happened. On Luna, the moon of Terra, a webway gate that had been sealed since the time of the Great Crusade suddenly opened, and from it emerged the battered, bloodied, but very much alive figure of Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, resurrected from 10,000 years of near death by the combined efforts of the Eldari and the power of their newly awakened god, Inead. Guilliman's journey to Terra, known as the Terran Crusade, had been an odyssey of its own. After being resurrected on Macragge and liberating Ultramar from the forces of chaos, the Primarch had assembled a massive crusade fleet to reach Terra. But the journey was anything but straightforward. Near the Maelstrom, a great warp rift in its own right, the Terran crusade fleet was intercepted by Magnus the Red and the Thousand Suns. The demon Primarch cast a sorcerous ritual that flung Guilliman's entire fleet into the Maelstrom, trapping them in a labyrinth of twisted reality from which escape seemed impossible. It was only through an unlikely alliance with the Eldari Harlequins, those mysterious warrior performers who served the Laughing God, that Guilliman found a way out. The Harlequins guided the Terran Crusade through the Webway, the ancient extra-dimensional highway system created by the Old Ones millions of years before humanity even existed. The Webway was not safe, far from it. as it was haunted by demons and worse things that lurked in the spaces between dimensions. But it offered a path that bypassed the warp storms and the chaos fleets that blocked conventional routes to the Sol system. The final leg of the journey was the most dangerous. The Harlequins revealed that a secret exit from the webway existed on Luna, as one that had not been used since before the heresy. But Magnus the Red had been waiting for exactly this moment. The demon Primarch had positioned his 1,000 sons within the webway itself, ready to flood through the gate behind Guilliman and launch a surprise invasion of the Sol system. If the 1,000 sons succeeded, they would bypass every orbital defense, every minefield, every fortress world in the system, and emerge directly on Terra's doorstep. While Guilliman had fought his way across the galaxy to reach Terra, battling chaos forces at every turn, his arrival was not unopposed. Magnus the Red, the demon Primarch of the 1,000 Sons, had been lying in wait within the webway, hoping to use the opening of the Lunar Gate to launch his own invasion of the Sol system. A desperate battle erupted as the 1,000 Sons poured through the webway behind Guilliman, and only the combined efforts of the Primarch, the Harlequins, the Sisters of Silence, and the Imperial Fists managed to drive Magnus back and permanently seal the webway portal so it could never be used to threaten Terra again. But Guilliman had arrived. A Primarch walked among mortals for the first time in 10,000 years. And even as the darkness pressed in from all sides, even as the cults conducted their sacrifices, and the hive cities burned, and the great rift cast its baleful glow across the galaxy, the presence of a son of the Emperor on Terra offered something that had been in desperately short supply: hope. That hope was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The blood god Khorne has never been known for patience. Where Tzeentch schemes and Nurgle endures and Slaanesh savors, Khorne acts. He is the god of war, the lord of battles, the collector of skulls. His domain is violence in its purest form, and he cares not from where the blood flows, so long as it flows in rivers. And in the closing days of the 41st millennium, with the great rift tearing across the galaxy and the barriers between dimensions crumbling, Khorne saw an opportunity that his brother gods were still too occupied to seize. The blood god struck at Terra. It happened with terrifying swiftness. Across the hive cities of Terra, the chaos cults that had been operating in the open during the days of blinding finally played their ultimate hand. Cultists and their maddened throngs, who had taken over swaths of Terra's population centers, conducted mass sacrifices of captured guardsmen and civilians, offering their hearts to the blood god in rituals of such concentrated violence that the barriers between dimensions buckled under the strain. Warp storms opened in the sky above Terra. Not small, localized rifts that could be contained and sealed by the Sisters of Silence, but massive, screaming wounds in reality that stretched from horizon to horizon. And from these wounds poured the legions of Khorne. 88 demonic cohorts, a number sacred to the blood god, descended upon Terra's soil. At their head strode 8 bloodthirsters, the greater demons of Khorne, towering creatures of brass and fury, whose very presence drove mortal minds to madness and whose weapons burned with the fires of the warp. These were not random demons summoned by amateur sorcerers. This was a coordinated invasion force, sent by Khorne himself to prove his superiority over the other chaos gods by being the one to breach the defenses of the throne world and claim the skull of the Emperor for the Skull Throne. And it began to rain blood. That detail bears repeating because it captures the sheer wrongness of what was happening. Blood fell from the sky over Terra, the homeworld of humanity, the most sacred world in the galaxy. It streamed down the walls of the Imperial Palace, and it pooled in the streets of the hive cities. It stained the robes of the priests and the armor of the soldiers and the clothes of the civilians who huddled in their hablocks, praying to an emperor who seemed unable or unwilling to protect them. Blood rain on Terra. For a moment, try to put yourself in the position of an ordinary citizen of Terra during this event. You have lived your entire life in a block in one of the great hive cities. Your world is one of grinding routine, out of 12-hour shifts in the manufactorum, of thin gruel and recycled water and the constant hum of machinery. You have never seen the sky, not really. Your block is buried deep in the lower levels, where the light of the sun never reaches, and the air smells of rust and sweat and the chemical tang of the water recyclers. You have been told all your life that the Emperor protects, that Terra is the safest place in the galaxy, that the enemies of mankind cannot touch the throne world. And then the ceiling of your block begins to drip red. At first, you think it is a burst pipe, some malfunction in the water system that happens every few months, and that the tech thralls will eventually fix. But the liquid is warm, and it is thick, and when it touches your skin, it does not run clean. It is blood, real blood, falling from above, seeping through the layers of construction above you, as if the world itself is bleeding. You hear screaming from the levels above. Not the usual screams of violence or despair that you have learned to ignore, but something different, something that raises the hair on the back of your neck and makes your bowels turn to water. And then you hear the sounds of gunfire, not the measured crack of laser gunfire that the Arbites use, but the rapid, desperate thunder of weapons being fired on full automatic by people who are terrified out of their minds. You do not know it yet, but demons are walking through your city, as creatures of brass and fire, born from the stuff of nightmares, are killing everything in their path, and the blood that falls from the sky is both a symptom and a sacrament, an offering to the god of war who has sent his servants to claim the most precious prize in the galaxy. This is what it was like when chaos reached Terra for the second time. Not the grand strategic narratives of primarchs and demon princes and galaxy-spanning crusades, but the intimate, a personal horror of ordinary people, realizing that the promises they had been told all their lives were empty, that the safety they had been assured of was an illusion, and that the darkness they had been told could never reach them was standing in their living room with a sword made of hatred and a mouth full of burning teeth. The demonic horde moved with terrifying speed and coordination toward the Imperial Palace, is assaulting the Lion's Gate with a ferocity that made the Heresy-era siege look almost restrained by comparison. The defenses of the palace, formidable as they were, had been designed primarily to repel conventional military attacks. The weapons emplacements rained down ruin upon the demon hordes, and the void shields held against the worst of the warp energy being thrown at them. But demons are not conventional enemies. They do not need supply lines. They do not suffer from morale failures. They simply exist, and they fight, and they kill, until they are destroyed, or the warp energy that sustains them is exhausted. Whatever loyal Imperial forces were outside the palace walls, when the demons appeared, were swallowed up almost immediately. Guardsmen and Arbites who had been fighting the chaos cults in the hive cities found themselves suddenly facing bloodletters and flesh hounds and juggernauts of Horn, enemies that no amount of laser gun fire could stop. The slaughter was immense. Inside the palace, Trajan Valoris led the Adeptus Custodes into battle. Close to 4,000 custodians, the finest warriors in the Imperium, sallied forth from the palace gates to meet the demonic host. Alongside them fought contingents of Grey Knights, the elite demon-hunting chapter of Space Marines, their psychically charged weapons blazing with silver fire as they carved through the warp-spawned creatures. Shield Captain Valerian, one of the most distinguished custodians of his generation, led strike teams into the worst of the fighting, his guardian spear reaping a terrible toll among the demons. But even the custodians, even the Grey Knights, were being overwhelmed. The sheer number of demons was staggering. For every one that was banished, 3 more seemed to take its place, pouring from the warp rifts in an endless tide of brass and blood. More than half the custodians who sallied forth were killed in the fighting, as a loss ratio that the 10,000 had not suffered since the Webway War during the heresy itself. It was at this desperate moment that the Sisters of Silence arrived. Recalled by Trajan Valoris and flown in by Aquila landers from their orbital stations, these psychic blanks were the perfect counter to the demonic host. Their very presence weakened the daemons, disrupting the warp energy that sustained them in the material realm, making them vulnerable to conventional weapons and causing the weakest among them to simply dissolve back into the Imperium. Under the command of Tanau Alea, one of their most senior warriors, the Sisters of Silence formed a living wall of anti-psychic energy that blunted the demon advance and gave the defenders the breathing room they desperately needed. And then Guilliman arrived. The Primarch had barely set foot on Terra before the demons attacked. He had fought his way through the webway, battled the Thousand Suns on Luna, and was still processing the shock of seeing what his father's Imperium had become in 10,000 years of stagnation and decay. But Rabuta Guilliman was nothing if not a pragmatist, and the sight of demons assaulting the walls of his father's palace was all the motivation he needed. Guilliman led the counterattack personally, wielding the Emperor's own flaming sword and wearing the armor of fate, an ancient suit of power armor reforged with the combined technologies of the Imperium and the Aeldari. The Primarch was a force of nature on the battlefield, cutting through bloodletters and greater demons with equal ease, his presence rallying the defenders and inspiring them to feats of valor that would have been impossible moments before. The battle raged for hours, but with Guilliman at its head, the tide began to turn. The combination of the Custode's martial prowess, the Grey Knight's psychic weaponry, the Sisters of Silence's null aura, and the Primarch's superhuman combat ability proved too much even for the Blood God's legions. One by one, the Bloodthirsters fell, their massive forms dissolving back into the warp as the defenders concentrated their fire and their fury upon them. The demonic cohorts, deprived of their leaders and weakened by the Sisters of Silence, began to lose coherence, yet the warp energy sustaining them in the material realm flickering and fading. When the last of the greater demons was banished, the remaining lesser demons evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. The warp rifts in the sky began to close, the barriers between dimensions reasserting themselves as the sacrificial energy that had opened them was exhausted. The blood rain stopped. The sky, still tinged with the angry colors of the Great Rift, no longer screamed with the voices of demons. Terra was saved, but the cost was staggering. The aftermath of the Battle of Lion's Gate, as it came to be known, was a period of frantic activity and painful reckoning. Thousands of custodians lay dead. Entire sections of the hive cities surrounding the palace had been reduced to ruins. The civilian casualties from the demon attack itself and from the cult uprisings that had preceded it numbered in the billions. The psychological damage was perhaps even worse than the physical. For 10,000 years, the people of Terra had been told that their world was inviolable, that the Emperor's presence made the throne world proof against the horrors of the warp. That illusion was shattered forever. Before the dust had settled, war bands of the Inquisition began scouring the surroundings of the Imperial Palace, dealing with any lingering chaos taint with extreme prejudice. The Sisters of Silence were given back their old strongholds, as an acknowledgement that their unique abilities would be needed more than ever in the days ahead. And Guilliman himself took the mantle of Lord Commander of the Imperium, the same title his father had bestowed upon Horus so many millennia ago, and began the long, painful process of reforming the Imperium for the wars that were coming. It is said that Khorne, watching from his brass throne in the warp, was so enraged by the failure of his invasion that he obliterated the 8 bloodthirsters who had led the assault, destroying them utterly rather than allowing them to reform in the Imperium. For a greater demon, whose existence is normally cyclical, death followed by eventual rebirth in the warp, this was a fate worse than banishment. They were simply gone, erased from existence by the fury of the very god they had served. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the Battle of Lion's Gate was not the physical damage or the casualties, or even the political upheaval that followed. It was the shattering of a belief. As one senior Imperial official later remarked, that was the moment when the old rules changed. The Imperium could no longer pretend that Terra was safe. They could no longer hide behind the fiction that the Emperor's wards made the throne world impervious to demonic incursion. Yes, the demons had come to Terra. They had walked its streets and killed its people and assaulted the very gates of the imperial palace. And if it happened once, in the closing days of the 41st millennium, it could happen again. Some have speculated, in the shadowed corridors of the Inquisition and the quiet councils of the Adeptus Custodes, that the Battle of Lion's Gate was not entirely what it appeared. There are those who believe that the Emperor himself allowed the wards to fall, that he deliberately dimmed the Astronomicon and lowered the psychic defenses of Terra in order to create the conditions for the demon invasion. The reasoning, according to this theory, is that the Emperor needed Guilliman to arrive on Terra at exactly the right moment, and he needed the crisis of a demon attack to force the fractious High Lords to accept his son's authority without question. If this theory is true, then the Battle of Lion's Gate was not a chaos victory at all, but an act of calculated manipulation by the Emperor, sacrificing thousands of his own custodians and billions of Terra's citizens to achieve a strategic objective that no other method could have accomplished. It is the kind of cold, ruthless calculus that the Emperor has been accused of before, and it is a reminder that even 10,000 years of death and silence have not diminished the master of mankind's willingness to spend human lives in pursuit of humanity's survival. And whether the Emperor planned it or not, the result was the same. Guilliman was established as Lord Commander of the Imperium. The Sisters of Silence were restored to their former prominence. The Adeptus Custodes, shaken from their 10,000-year vigil by the demon attack, began to venture beyond the palace walls for the first time in millennia, recognizing that the defense of the Emperor could no longer be conducted from behind closed doors, and the Imperium, for all its wounds, but for all its losses, for all the terrible knowledge that its most sacred world was no longer safe, began to prepare for whatever came next. The question that hangs over everything, the question that no one in the Imperium can answer with any certainty, is simply this: what comes next? The galaxy of the 42nd millennium, the era Indomitus, as imperial historians have named it, is a place of unprecedented danger and uncertainty. Or the old certainties that held the Imperium together for 10,000 years have been shattered one by one, like the pylons of Cadia. The Astronomicon, once an unwavering beacon, now flickers and dims as the energies of the Great Rift press against it. The isolation of entire regions of imperial space has created pockets of anarchy and desperation where chaos cults flourish unopposed. The Primaris Space Marines, Guilliman's new breed of enhanced warriors, bolster the Imperium's military capabilities, but even their numbers cannot fill the void left by 10,000 years of attrition and decline. Consider the sheer scale of the problem facing the defenders of humanity. The Imperium spans 1 million worlds, many of them separated by distances that take months or years to travel, even with a functioning Astronomicon and favorable warp conditions. Communication between these worlds relies on astropathic relays that are fragile, unreliable, and increasingly compromised by the turbulence of the Great Rift. Supply chains that once stretched across the galaxy have been severed. Military forces that were barely sufficient to defend the Imperium's borders before the rift opened are now stretched impossibly thin, forced to defend on every front simultaneously against enemies who are more numerous and more powerful than they have ever been. The Great Rift still burns across the galaxy, a wound in reality that shows no sign of healing. Or on the far side, in the Imperium Nihilus, billions of Imperial citizens live in darkness, cut off from the Astronomicon's light, fighting for survival against enemies that press in from all sides. On the near side, in the Imperium Sanctus, Guilliman's Indomitus crusade has made progress in stabilizing the situation, but the scale of the crisis is almost beyond comprehension. There are more threats than there are forces to meet them, and every victory in one sector comes at the cost of attention diverted from another. Abaddon the Despoiler remains at large, his forces battered but unbroken, his grand strategy partially fulfilled. The Cadian Gate is gone, the Great Rift is open. The Crimson Path stretches from the Eye of Terra toward the Sol System, and while the road to Terra is not yet clear, it is closer to being open than it has been at any point since the heresy. Abaddon's forces are rebuilding, gathering strength for whatever comes next. Some among the Inquisition believe that the despoiler is planning a final, massive push toward Terra itself, a 14th Black Crusade that would make all the others look like preliminary skirmishes. The demon Primarchs continue to plague the galaxy. Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons have been particularly active, launching psychic assaults and sorcerous campaigns that spread Sench's influence across scores of worlds. Mortarion and the Death Guard wage a war of pestilence, their plague wars against Ultramar representing only one front in a much larger campaign to spread Nurgle's gifts across the galaxy. The other traitor Primarchs stir in their demonic strongholds, and there are rumors that some who have been silent for millennia are preparing to take to the field once more. And on Terra itself, the scars of the Battle of Lion's Gate remain. The physical damage has been repaired, the walls rebuilt, the defenses strengthened, but the psychological wound runs deeper. The people of Terra now know that their world can be attacked. The defenders know that the wards can fail. The High Lords know that the political structures they have maintained for 10 millennia are fragile and corruptible. Every aspect of life on the throne world has been touched by the knowledge that chaos can reach them. The Adeptus Custodes have undergone a transformation in the wake of the battle. Under Trajan Valoris's leadership, the Golden Warriors have expanded their operations beyond the palace walls, deploying shield companies across the galaxy to address threats that could eventually reach Terra. This is a dramatic departure from 10,000 years of precedent, and it speaks to the severity of the current crisis. And the Custodes recognize that the best defense of the Emperor is not a purely passive vigil, but an active campaign to destroy threats before they can grow large enough to threaten the throne world. This change in custodian doctrine is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it tells us something profound about the state of the Imperium. For 10,000 years, the Custodes believed that their duty was best served by remaining within the palace, a static defense force waiting for threats to come to them. This was not cowardice or laziness. It was a philosophical position, a belief that the Emperor's safety was best guaranteed by concentrating the finest warriors in the galaxy around his physical person. The Blood Games, those elaborate war games in which custodians would attempt to penetrate the palace's own defenses in order to identify and correct weaknesses, kept them sharp and prepared. But they did not leave Terra. They did not engage with the wider galaxy's problems. They watched, and they waited. The Battle of Lion's Gate shattered that philosophy. The demons did not approach Terra through conventional means that could have been detected and intercepted by fleet patrols or sector defenses. They appeared directly on Terran soil, summoned by cultists who had been operating under the noses of the Inquisition and the Arbites for years, perhaps decades. The threat did not come from without. Yet it came from within, and no amount of static defense could have prevented it. Valoris understood this, and he acted. Custodian shield companies now deploy across the galaxy, hunting down threats that the Custodes' intelligence networks identify as potentially capable of reaching Terra. They work alongside, and sometimes in uncomfortable proximity to, the Inquisition, the Grey Knights, and other imperial institutions. Thus, they bring to these operations a level of martial excellence and analytical capability that no other force in the Imperium can match, and their very presence on a battlefield sends a message. The Emperor's own guardians are watching, and they will not allow another Lion's Gate to happen. But even the Custodes cannot be everywhere at once. Their numbers, while replenished since the nadir following the heresy, are still limited. They are a precision instrument, not a sledgehammer. And the scale of the threats facing the Imperium in the Era Indomitus demands both. The galaxy is burning, and putting out the fires one at a time, no matter how efficiently, may not be enough. The Sisters of Silence have similarly been reinvigorated, their role in the defense of Terra expanded, and their numbers reinforced. Their psychic null abilities make them invaluable against both demonic incursions and the rogue psychers, whose numbers have been increasing since the opening of the Great Rift, a phenomenon known as the Psychic Awakening. More humans are manifesting psychic abilities than at any point in history, and while some of these new psychers are brought into the service of the Imperium, Many others are driven mad by their uncontrolled abilities or fall prey to the predatory entities of the warp. The question of the Golden Throne itself looms large over everything. The ancient device has been deteriorating for millennia. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus who maintain it admit, in their most private moments, that they do not fully understand how it works, and that they are running out of ways to keep it functioning. If the Golden Throne fails, the Emperor dies. And if the Emperor dies, the consequences are almost too terrible to contemplate. The Astronomicon goes dark permanently. Then the psychic wards protecting Terra collapse. The sealed webway portal beneath the palace, which the Emperor has held closed through sheer force of will for 10,000 years, reopens, and demons pour into the heart of the Imperium from an entirely new direction. The Talisman of 7 Hammers, a device installed by the Primarch Vulcan during the heresy, serves as a dead man's switch. If the Golden Throne fails, the talisman will detonate, and destroying not just the palace but all of Terra in a cataclysmic explosion designed to deny the planet to chaos. It is the ultimate expression of the Imperium's grim philosophy. Better to destroy everything than to let it fall into the hands of the enemy. There have been attempts to find alternatives. Secret expeditions have been launched into the webway and beyond, seeking technologies or allies that might repair the Golden Throne or find another way to sustain the Emperor. As some of these expeditions have involved cooperation with Xenos species, a fact that would be considered the most extreme heresy if it became widely known. The Aeldari, particularly the faction known as the Inari, who worship a newly awakened god of the dead, have hinted that they possess knowledge that could help, but their own motives remain opaque, and their reliability as allies is a matter of intense debate. Then there is the most disturbing possibility of all, and one that no one in the Imperium dares speak aloud, except in the most secure and heavily warded chambers. What if the Emperor is not merely dying? What if he is changing? Some reports from the Sanctum Imperialis suggest that the Emperor's psychic presence has been growing stronger in recent years, not weaker. Guilliman, after meeting with his father upon his arrival on Terra, was reportedly deeply shaken by the experience, in suggesting that whatever he encountered on the Golden Throne was not the benevolent father figure that Imperial propaganda had led him to expect. The Emperor's mind, subjected to 10,000 years of constant warfare against the Chaos Gods, sustained by the suffering of millions of sacrificed psykers, may have been transformed into something that defies easy categorization. Is the Emperor still the protector of mankind, or has he become something else entirely? Is the Golden Throne a life support system or a prison? Is the Imperium fighting to preserve its greatest hero or to contain a being whose power has grown beyond any mortal comprehension? These are questions that no one can answer, and the uncertainty adds another layer of dread to a situation already saturated with fear. What we know, what the lore makes undeniably clear, is that chaos has already reached Terra twice. Once during the heresy, was when Horus and his traitor legions breached the walls of the Imperial Palace and fought their way to the Eternity Gate. And once again, at the close of the 41st Millennium, when the legions of Khorne poured from warp rifts in the sky and assaulted the Lion's Gate, while blood rained from the clouds. Both times, Terra was saved. Both times, the cost was devastating. And both times, the margin of victory was so thin, so fragile, so dependent on circumstances that could easily have gone the other way, that to call either battle a victory feels like a cruel joke. The first time, Terra was saved because the Emperor was willing to sacrifice himself, to risk everything in a personal confrontation with Horus that left him broken and dying. The second time, Terra was saved because a Primarch happened to arrive at exactly the right moment, armed with exactly the right allies and exactly the right weapons to turn the tide. Or there is a pattern here that should concern anyone who cares about the survival of the Imperium. Each time chaos reaches Terra, it is driven back only by an extraordinary intervention that cannot be replicated or relied upon. The Emperor cannot sacrifice himself again. He is already on the Golden Throne, already giving everything he has to sustain the Astronomicon and the wards and the Webway seal. Guilliman cannot be resurrected a second time. He is already here, already fighting, or already stretched to the breaking point by the demands of commanding a crumbling empire across a divided galaxy. What happens the third time? What miracle will save Terra when Abaddon finally gathers his forces for the last push? What hero will appear at the 11th hour to turn back the tide of demons and traitors? The honest answer is, no one knows. And that uncertainty, that gnawing void where confidence should be, is perhaps the greatest weapon that chaos possesses. And it does not need to conquer Terra in a single, decisive stroke. It merely needs to keep pressing, keep testing, keep probing for weakness, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, until the defenders make one mistake, one lapse, one moment of wavering faith, and the door swings open for the last time. What happens when the third time comes, and there is no emperor to rise from the golden throne, no primarch waiting in the wings, and no last-minute miracle to snatch victory from the jaws of annihilation? What happens when Abaddon finally completes his crimson path and leads the combined forces of chaos to the gates of the Imperial Palace for the last time? No one knows. And perhaps that is the most terrifying thing of all. In a galaxy that has seen 10,000 years of war, in an Imperium that has survived horrors that would drive lesser civilizations to extinction, the uncertainty of the future remains the greatest enemy of all. The Chaos Gods are patient. They have waited 10,000 years already. They can wait 10,000 more, or they can strike tomorrow. The Great Rift is open, the barriers are weakened, and the forces of the Imperium press against the thin membrane of reality with a hunger that is insatiable and eternal. Terra stands. The palace stands. The Emperor endures upon his golden throne. Had his ruined body sustained by machines and sacrifice, his mind locked in an eternal war against the darkness. The custodies stand their vigil. The defenders man the walls. The people of Terra go about their lives in the shadow of the Great Rift, knowing in their bones, even if they cannot articulate it, that the darkness is closer than it has ever been, and that the next time it comes, it may not be pushed back. But they stand. That is the stubborn, bloody, defiant miracle of humanity in the 41st millennium. They stand. Against every horror, against every betrayal, against every demon and traitor and nightmare that the galaxy has thrown at them, they stand. Not because they are unafraid, not because they believe they will win, but because the alternative is surrender, and the people of Terra, the children of the Emperor, would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also endurance. There is also defiance. There is also the refusal to give up, even when giving up seems like the only rational response to an irrational universe. And as long as one human heart beats with the will to resist, as long as one soldier stands upon the walls and one psyker feeds the Astronomicon, and one custodian guards the Golden Throne, the forces of chaos will find that reaching Terra is one thing, but conquering it is something else entirely. The road to Terra is long and bloody and paved with the bones of 10,000 years of war. Chaos has walked that road before, and it will walk it again. But Terra endures. The Emperor endures. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. And that, friends, is the story of when chaos finally reached Terra. From the first betrayal of the Horus heresy to the blood rain that fell upon the Lion's Gate, from the crimson path of Abaddon to the great rift that tore the galaxy in half, and we have followed the long, terrible march of the ruinous powers toward the heart of the Imperium. We have walked through the ashes of the first siege and stood upon the walls during the second. We have seen the courage of the defenders and the cunning of the attackers, the sacrifices made and the prices paid. And now the story continues, as all stories in the 41st millennium do, with the promise of more war, more suffering, more desperate heroism in the face of impossible odds. The great rift still burns. Abaddon still schemes. The demon primarchs still hunger for vengeance. And on Terra, the Emperor sits in silence upon his golden throne, his thoughts and his intentions unknowable, his power a flickering candle in a galaxy of darkness. What comes next is anyone's guess. But if history has taught us anything, it is that chaos never stops trying. The question is not whether they will reach Terra again. The question is when, and whether the defenders of mankind will be ready when they do. If you enjoyed this journey through the lore, I would truly appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps this community grow and allows me to keep creating content like this for all of you. If there are other topics from the Warhammer 40,000 universe that you would like to see explored in this style, drop a comment below, and I will do my best to bring those stories to life. Until next time, keep your faith strong, your bolter loaded, and your eyes on the sky. For in the grim darkness of the far future, the only thing standing between you and the abyss is the will to endure. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.